Today we are delighted to have Claire Driscoll, who is the Director of the Technology Transfer Office at the National Human Genome Research Institute with us. And she's going to tell us about the National Institutes of Health, where she works, and the NHGRI is part of the National Institutes of Health. Claire is a board member for PXE International. She's been a board member since about 2003. And she first had contact with PXE International in 2000 when she met Sharon and Pat Terry, who were at the NIH serving as advisors to her institute. And she's been advising us ever since on patent issues and technology transfer issues. And she has a lot of knowledge about the NIH and a lot of interest in what they are doing for PXE International. So with that, Claire, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to just go through my slides, but this can be informal. I can take questions through the chat box or as we go along. I may stop every few slides and see if there are any questions. But what I'm going to do is just talk about the NIH in particular and why it's important for helping patients and just what we do here at the NIH. So for context, I've been here since 1990. I came in right out of graduate school, and I did research in a lab for about 4 years, and then I moved to the research administration side, where I've been since 1994. So even though my job function is, as Chris explained, managing intellectual property and dealing with negotiating deals with outside entities, I'm really not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk more about the NIH in general, how it relates to like a patient advocacy group like PXE International, and just what we do. So that's just a bit of background about me. And as Chris said, I've been on the board for a number of years. I've known Pat and Sharon for many years. And I think the PXE does a wonderful job in both educating their community, but also moving research forward to try to find treatments and cures for PXE. So I'm very impressed with the organization, which is why I volunteered my time. So, okay, the NIH. Some context. So this is just a schematic showing you kind of how you move from doing basic research all the way up to having treatments or drugs out on the market. And what I want to emphasize here is it is a pipeline. So in other words, if you don't have stuff here at the bottom, if you're not trying to learn about basic biological processes, understanding how things work, both in non-humans and in humans, it's pretty hard to work your way up this funnel to start doing more applied research. It's hard to discover drugs if you really don't know what's wrong. So you can't really do clinical trials. You can't really move into having products on the market that people can access. And so what NIH does is we're here at the bottom. We both conduct research, and we also fund research. And again, the key word here is biomedical. That's where we live. We don't fund other types of research. That's for different government agencies. We fund basic, and we don't do a lot of applied research until you get to the clinical trial phase. Some people consider that applied. But we fund basically increasing scientific knowledge. Hopefully, at a certain point, that knowledge can be translated into new drugs. And so that's where we are. So I'm going to go back to my first slide because I forgot to mention there's a lot of acronyms and it's a big organization, so I want to take a minute to go through that. So this is in order of big to small. So I'm here in the Human Genome Research Institute. We're one of 27 institutes that are part of NIH. And the key part of the NIH name here is we have an S here, the National Institutes, plural, of Health. So there's 27 separate institutes. My institute is one of those 27. NIH itself is part of a larger government agency. We're part of the Public Health Service, and the Public Health Service is in turn part of a very large department, the Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS. DHHS does things like Medicare, Medicaid programs. They also help fund the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control, as well as NIH. So this is kind of, again, you can see by the name, Health and Human Services. So NIH is just part of this much larger organization. But we're government. So we're a government organization, government employees, and we're doing this to serve the public. And so I think people sometimes forget, we definitely are different than a university, we're different than a company, we're a government organization. And so it makes sense, probably logically, a company is not going to do a lot of basic research. There's no profit to be made in that. So really, if you're going to have research done, really fundamental research, who's going to do it? Who's going to pay for it? It makes sense to have the government do that. That's a good role for us. And then later on, as things move along and you get closer to maybe have an economic benefit, you'll get the commercial sector involved. So again, just a few stats here. NIH we do biomedical research, and you hear about us a lot in that context. And the reason is more than 80% of the total government money that goes to biomedical research comes to NIH. So if you see this graph, 82% of the money in 2007 that went to biomedical research went to NIH. And so these other agencies just have a tiny amount of the money. So if you're a researcher out there, where are you going to go if you need money or grant to do biomedical research? You're going to come to NIH because we have most of that money. That's our responsibility. Each government agency has different responsibilities. Our primary focus, again, is funding and supporting biomedical research. That's what we do. And so we get the bulk of the money in that area.
Claire, I have a question. You've mentioned biomedical research a lot of times. Is there a difference between biomedical research and medical research?
Oh, sure, absolutely, because it's a good question. So we're not focused on just things that have immediate use in humans, immediate medical benefits. We're interested in general biological research. How do living things function? How do they work? So biomedical means bio plus medical is the way to look at it. So, and of course we're not so strict. Some things we do would, obviously have to do with chemistry or other things, but in general we're working at the more basic level. So things that are a little further from application. So that's why we don't say medical, because it's not really ready to go into patients in many cases. Okay. So again, this is just a schematic, a nice quote from FDR, who was one of the people that kind of helped to get the NIH campus founded in Bethesda, Maryland, saying we can't be a strong nation unless we're a healthy nation. And so that's kind of rationale for why we exist. So I'm not going to talk much about the economic impact of this sort of research, but I did want to point out a couple stats. I'm going to, just so that people, I think most people are concerned about health. Everyone's touched by health. But still, there's another benefit to what we do here at NIH and the research we fund. It actually creates many, many jobs. It's created entire industries. The entire biotechnology industry is really a result of research funded and carried out by the NIH, if you think about it. The pharmaceutical industry relies on us. And so we're an important source of innovation. And we create jobs, and a lot of money is leveraged. You take the research money and it goes out, and the companies are able to leverage what we do into profits. So it has a big economic impact as well as an impact on people's health. So again, this is a picture of the main administrative building at NIH, which is very imaginatively named Building 1. It's the first building built here in Bethesda, Maryland. And so just as far as history goes, the NIH was started back in the late 1800s, and we moved here to the Bethesda campus in about 1940. That was, again, President Roosevelt did that. So we created the campus, which is in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And then in 1948, we became plural. So in other words, we went from the National Institute, singular, of Health to National Institutes with an S. Currently, there are 27 institutes that make up the NIH. And again, we do two things. We try to increase the amount of scientific knowledge out in the world by funding research, and we try to improve public health. So those are our two biggest missions. The other thing to realize is this is a lot of money here. We are the largest financial backer of this type of research in the world. So the U.S. government spends more money on biomedical research than any company, any other country. This is a huge investment. That's your dollars. It's taxpayer dollars that fund all this. So here's a quick summary of the 4 things that we do. We do a lot of training. So we do training of researchers as well as clinicians. And people don't realize that. They sometimes think that everyone who works at NIH is a government employee. But in fact, a large portion of the people are trainees. So they're here for a few years, and less than 1% of them will stay on permanently. So thousands of young people who are interested in having a career in science or medicine come through the NIH for training. We also have our own in-house research program, so we do research here on the campus. We have labs, we have full-time employees. We do clinical trials, which I'll talk a little bit about that. Clinical trials are where you take an experimental or a new drug that hasn't been tested in humans, and you test it in humans to see if it's safe and to see if it's effective for a certain disorder. And we fund a great deal of research, and that money goes out mainly to universities. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So those are kind of the 4 big areas that we cover. So I'm going to stop for a second and see if there are any questions on that kind of introductory material. Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. This is a picture of the NIH Clinical Center. As you can see, it's a huge building. I'm told it's the 2nd largest brick building in the world. This is the newer part, and back here is the older part. It's a hospital as well as a research center, so there are labs, and there are also clinical studies going on in hospital beds. The unique thing about this is that it's not a hospital that takes general admissions. There's no emergency room. There's no maternity. You can only be a patient here if you are in a clinical protocol. In other words, you're a volunteer for a clinical study, and so then you can be admitted to the hospital. So it's very different than a regular hospital. At any one time, there are more than 1,000, almost 1,500 research protocols, clinical studies going on at any one time in the clinical center. Anyone who participates, it doesn't cost them or their insurance company anything. All the services are free. And right now, we're averaging about half of the studies we do are what we call natural history, where you're not really treating someone with a new experimental drug, but you're just studying the natural course of a disease. Because again, if you don't know what the course of a disease is, it's hard to know when you give someone an experimental drug whether the drug is helping them or harming them in any way if you don't know what the normal course is of a disease. So you need something to benchmark your study against. And so that's something that's really not very lucrative for companies to do, but it's imperative, especially in rare disease research, to really understand how the disease typically progresses so that you can really understand if a drug is going to be safe and effective when you test it in people. So that's something very important that we do. The hope is that in the future, perhaps a PXE, natural history study, could be done here at the clinical center. We work on a lot of rare diseases because it's something where that's our specialty compared to other research centers. So again, we're the top. Go ahead,
sorry to interrupt. I was actually on mute and was trying to give you a question before when you asked for a question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Sorry. I wondered if you could talk a little bit. We have a question about how you train researchers and what kind of training do they get there?
Sure. So there's a lot of different training programs you can imagine. So we have some that are specifically for MDs, where they're going to work, say, in the clinical center, and they'll do patient care taught by experts. So it's it's clinical. We have others where we call it postdoctoral fellows, where people have finished a PhD, and they're now going to do research. So on the bench, wet lab research. Maybe they haven't had a lot of training; they've just been students. So we train them in that. Again, we're paying for their salaries and benefits, and they're working with world-class scientists. And we have programs that are combined, where people do some time in the clinic, seeing patients, some time in the lab. So MD, PhDs who have both degrees can do both. And then we also have programs that train people that are younger, that are not as far along in their career, people that maybe have just completed undergraduate studies, but they haven't gone to grad school yet, and they're not sure if they want to do research. They can come here and do a 1-year or 2-year fellowship where they work in a lab and see if that might be something that would be interesting for them. And then they'll leave here and go on and complete a graduate degree. So it's a variety of programs. We also have a lot of shorter training programs where people just come in for a month or a week or whatever it might be to take a special class or to do something like that. So it's a really wide range of training programs. At any one time, we have something like 5,000 trainees on the campus at any one time. So it's a very large program.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
All right, so again, the money here is big. I like to emphasize the number because it's sometimes hard to comprehend, but we're at about $32 billion with a B, $1 million per year. And that's really a huge, huge budget, especially as compared to even other wealthy countries, what they spend in this area. And so I think it's no coincidence that, you know, we're a leader in both the number of publications in the field, the number of new drugs that the government and other academics help bring out into the world, the strength of our pharmaceutical and biotech industries, all directly tied to having the U.S. government and its citizens supporting biomedical research and allowing taxpayer money to go into it. Because we're a government agency, a government institute, we have to be transparent. You know, we can't be secretive. We have to have kind of everything about what we do out there, which is good. So everything's publicly accessible. It's just a lot of information. So it can be overwhelming to go to our website, but the nice thing is everything's there. If you really want to know something about the NIH, it's on our website somewhere. I can guarantee it. The other issue we have is we just have a lot of stakeholders. So in addition to U.S. citizens who pay taxes that support us, you know, we have the Congress, we have academic scientists, we have pharmaceutical people, and we have people around the world, really, because we're not just serving U.S. citizens. You know, the research we do impacts patients and people around the world. And so that can be kind of tricky. It seems like we're never pleasing everyone, but again, it's part of what we do because we're a public agency. So a little bit of the nitty-gritty now. We use a lot of acronyms, and so I'll try not to do that, but just to give you a flavor, the 27 institutes are kind of the key part of our structure. And so those institutes are named in a very random way, unfortunately. So some are named according to the disease focus, so the National Cancer Institute is an example, the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disorders, NIDDK is another example, but others are named according to organ systems, like the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, or stage of life. You know, we have an institute for children's health. We have an institute on aging, and then sometimes scientific discipline, infectious disease and allergy and infectious diseases institute is another example. These are very awkward, long names, but that's the way the institutes were named, and that's what we would use them. Here are our logos for the 27. By law, we can't have more than 27 right now, and so we've had to actually get rid of one institute, NCRR it's called, the NIH Center for Research Resources, because we're creating a new center to work on translational medicine. What that means is trying to get things from the bench to the bedside. In other words, using basic research, but really working on the clinical trial aspect and really getting drugs out there that will help people, in particular for rare diseases, really focusing on moving things from the clinic to patients. And so we have a new institute that's going to start on October 1st to do that. And so that's called NCATS, N-C-A-T-S, which is another acronym, so the NIH Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. So that's a big deal. For NIH, some people are saying we're getting into the drug development field, but we're not. We're trying to work on rare diseases, neglected diseases, things that companies don't always work on. So there really isn't any overlap with industry. We're trying to move things forward so that patients, like people with PXE, that diseases that aren't studied at companies, that there'll still be drugs coming out and treatments to help them. So again, why should you bother if you're out there either in industry or you're a researcher or whoever you are? Why is it important to know about the NIH? Well, the one thing is the money. We have a lot of money to give out. We do that mostly as grants or contracts. We also have a lot of expertise, so we collaborate with scientists around the world. We have a lot of technologies that companies will take and commercialize. And then we create a lot of tools for scientists, both actual biological tools, reagents, but also databases and other things that just helps them do their research better and faster. And again, if the government doesn't do it, probably nobody else will. So it's creating these resources that help research move forward faster is what we're trying to do. And we also help with, again, clinical studies and sometimes the step before clinical studies, which is called preclinical, before clinical, which may involve doing things in cell lines or doing animal studies or all the things you need to do to make sure that once you give this particular product to a patient, a human, that it's safe. And you have to do a lot of studies before you're allowed to give anything to a human being. So we do a lot of that. Quickly, just to give you a sense of what the scale is, this is a lot of money. Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore is our #1 grant recipient for NIH money, and they average in a single year, they average over $600 million in money given to them, just a single university. And I put some others up here. The state of California averages almost $4 billion with a B, $4 billion a year in funding in the universities and institutions across the state. The state of Massachusetts has nearly $3 billion a year coming in. So again, this is big money, it's big business, but it also is really accelerating research, and that's the point. And so a lot of people think, well, universities, universities don't take government money. They get money from tuition, or they get money from companies maybe to do particular research, or maybe from their alumni, from their donors. But in fact, the large majority of money that goes to a university to do research comes from the government. It doesn't come from donors. It doesn't come from tuition. It comes from the government. And for universities that do biological research, most of that money comes from NIH. So I think people don't realize that we're really actually supporting the entire university system through government funding. Okay, so I'm going to, again, stop for a second and see if there are any other questions.
A question relating to PXE. Is there a way to know how much of the NIH budget was actually used to study rare diseases?
There are ways to do that. At the very end of my slides, I have a database that shows all of our funding, and you can search that database for keywords and disease names and things like that and come up with that. But definitely, PXE is a small amount of money. I mean, it really is. I don't know what it is, but it's pretty small. As far as rare diseases, any one disease is small, but collectively, it can be a lot of money. So again, there are 7,000 designated rare diseases, and then if you include neglected diseases, things like tropical diseases that only affect people in the developing world, things like parasitic diseases that, companies don't work. If you include all of that, I mean, you're talking about, billions of dollars. I'd have to look in the database to see. But in general, NIH has a real focus on rare and neglected. That's kind of what we do, since others don't do it.
So that's the major focus in a sense.
Not the major, but it's one of our focuses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the website. So if there was anything specific to PXE going on right now, you might be able to find reference to it on the website?
Yeah, it's a searchable website. It's called, it's right at the end. It's called the NIH Reporter. Just has all our stats. But I can tell you off the top of my head. I mean, there are several researchers that this community probably knows about. For example, Emily Chu at the National Eye Institute is an eye expert, a physician who has done some work in the PXE community. Mike Dean with the National Cancer Institute has developed a mouse model of PXE, which is a very valuable tool for PXE researchers. Michael Gottesman, who's very senior in the NIH, he works on the same protein family that the PXE gene encodes for a particular transporter protein, the ABC6 gene, and his lab works on these proteins, and he's collaborating with some PXE researchers. And there are some people doing some genetic studies of PXE. So these are all people that are NIH employees. They work inside the NIH. And then there's plenty of other people in the community, such as Yoni Wido at Thomas Jefferson University, who gets a lot of NIH grants to do his PXE research work. So a lot of the people in the PXE community, the researcher community, are either working for NIH or funded by NIH.
Thank you.
Okay. So again, we just develop a lot of things that is not economical either for a single researcher or for a company to do. So because what often happens for the community is something that's good for the larger community is actually not good for the individual scientist or lab. So in other words, what NIH tries to do is encourage people to share. We create these central repositories of animal models and reagent collections so that researchers won't just hoard or keep some of the valuable reagents they create because they're worried about publishing first or getting the next grant, but they're actually sharing with the community. So NIH kind of creates a lot of resources to encourage that, and we feel that facilitates moving research forward faster, because individual researchers have to look out for themselves, and they sometimes aren't going to be willing to be as collaborative as they might be because of different pressures they have. So NIH tries to make it easier for people to share and work together. Something some in the community may be familiar with, this is an example of the kind of philosophy NIH has, which is make things available to everyone, available for free with no restrictions. So the PubMed database is a perfect example. It's a database of the biomedical literature. It's very expensive to put all this stuff online, often in full text, and yet we do that and we make it available for free. Anyone with an internet connection can get these papers, and it's available, worldwide. It's available to companies. It's available to non-U.S. citizens. And again, we make these resources available to facilitate, faster, better research in the future. And we also have other databases like GenBank, which is a database of DNA sequence information from the Human Genome Project and from other projects. And these are really valuable databases that are used by literally millions of people, and we make them available again for free, no restrictions at all. All you need is an internet connection. So just a little bit more about our what we fund. We call what we do off-site, what we give out in money, we call it extramural, so outside. And that's generally universities, hospitals, research institutes, and some companies. So we give out grants to more than 3,000 organizations every year. So basically any university that you've heard of probably has an NIH grant. Any major research center, any teaching hospital, they all have NIH grants. And then many companies do as well. So again, it kind of, the tentacles of NIH go across the entire research community. And again, these are just some terminology, I won't go through it, but when we give out a grant, we basically give the money and say, just go off and do your best, I hope it goes well, I hope you publish. We don't really get involved beyond that. We have other agreements where NIH is kind of more of a partner. We're giving advice. And then sometimes we serve as a buyer, and that's just a contract, where we just need someone to do something for us and we pay them for that service. So those are kind of the three things we do. Here's just the website for the grant, the major the grant and contracts website for NIH. The one thing I just want to emphasize here is that we are a little different than other countries, and I do want to point this out. We give out our money based on a review process by other scientists. So in other words, we bring together hundreds of scientists who are experts in their field, and we ask them to read the grant applications and to rate them, to rank them. And so NIH employees don't do the ranking, and we have no influence. Congress people, senators, they cannot influence the process. It is strictly peer review. And so if a particular grant gets a high score, it doesn't matter whether you're a famous scientist or an unknown scientist. It doesn't matter whether you work for Harvard or you work for a tiny university. If you get a high score, you get funded, period. So there's no political influence, there isn't favoritism, there isn't nepotism. We do it based on peer review, and this is not the case in other places in the world. Many of the way they do their funding to universities or scientists is very political, and it's really not based on merit. And so that's kind of the cornerstone of how NIH decides to give out money. And we've had some cases where politicians have tried to interfere in the process, and NIH has stood firm and said, no, that's the cornerstone of it. If you take away this objective scientific review and make it political, you ruin the whole system. So again, we give out a lot of different grants. You don't have to worry about all these names, but the emphasis here is we give out small grants and we give out huge grants. So for the PXE community, when Sharon and Pat were first getting things going, they wanted to run a research meeting to bring together the people that were already working on PXE and have them meet for a couple of days and really talk about the science. What do we know? What don't we know? What should our priorities be going forward? And they got an NIH grant, a conference grant, to pay for that conference, to bring those scientists from around the world to all meet for a couple of days. So that was very valuable because bringing everyone together is the key for moving things forward. So that was a small conference grant. And then we have other grants that go to researchers that could be for millions or tens of millions of dollars. So again, there's a lot of different grants. There's training grants. There's research grants, and so it really does kind of is the underpinning for the research base in the U.S. So again, we also do our own research with government employees here in Bethesda, and we call that intramural or in-house, and that's about $3 billion a year of research. And we have about 18,000 employees currently. 1/3 are scientists, MDs or PhDs. And we do lots of collaborations with the private sector and with other government agencies and with academics. So it's a very bustling, big program here that we have. Like I said, 18,000 employees, the biggest employer in the Montgomery County here in Maryland. Okay. So I'll stop again and see if there are any other questions.
Yes, there was one about, could you go back to the last slide?
Sure.
Sorry. Oh, yes, intramural research. You mentioned a bunch of the, several of the researchers who are working on projects related to PXE, and I think most of them are intramural, so can you sort of expand on how that helps PXE International?
Well, it really doesn't matter, actually, if they're intramural or extramural. I mean, it doesn't. As long as they're working on PXE, that affects the community. So, you know, it just so happens that some of the folks I mentioned are employed by NIH, but they're doing the same type of research that, you know, Yoni Guido would do at Thomas Jefferson. I mean, they're just doing what research projects that interest them and that they feel are important. So they just happen to be here at NIH. So I don't think there's a big difference in, you know, type of research or quality of research. It's just where they happen to be employed.
Thank you.
But it is a little easier for people inside NIH, I have to say, to work on something that's less, that's rare or less commercially of interest to industry, since again, we're not, we have kind of a more generous budget. That's about the only difference.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we also partner with a lot of other researchers. So this is just a list of kind of the ways we partner. I won't go into it, but essentially there's a lot of different ways we can collaborate with other folks. And that's key in the PXE community. I mean, that's why Sharon and Pat have spent so much time bringing all the researchers together and trying to encourage, you know, younger, newer researchers that are just entering their careers to consider PXE as something to study, because there are resources now, there are people that have been working on it for a long time that they can collaborate with. They can go get samples from the biobank. They can do a lot of different things. And so, you know, part of that, bringing everyone together, you may have to have different agreements to do that. But in general, what you want is a, you know, a core nucleus of a certain number of researchers. If there's only one lab working on it, they have no one to work with. They have no one to interact with. So you kind of want this network going. And just to show you, NIH, even though we do a lot of basic research, that doesn't mean that we don't end up contributing to the development of new drugs. We do. So this is just a list of a few of our successes in terms of drugs that came out of the research program here in Bethesda, Maryland. Several of these are vaccines. And these have been very successful drugs that were a direct result of research done here in Bethesda. Again, it's a huge program. I'm with one particular institute of the 27, so I'm with the Human Genome Institute, best known for the Human Genome Project, which is here, though we finished it nearly 10 years ago. And we fund a lot of other projects. So this is just a partial list, and I'm only showing this to give you the kind of the scope. So we're one institute, one of 27, and yet we fund so many important large-scale programs. So if you imagine if you then, you know, do this times 27, for all the institutes, you just have a huge amount of research being conducted by NIH that's really, you know, in the future going to have an impact on people's lives. So the Human Genome Project was started, you know, nearly 20 years ago, and back then it cost us $3 or $4 billion to sequence one genome from one person. Now we can do it. We're not quite at $1,000 yet, but we can now sequence an individual's genome for maybe $20,000 or $30,000. So it's becoming very inexpensive, and that's because of all the research that we did. You know, the NIH funded research to make that technology cheaper and easier. And so now we're heading to a place where every single individual could have their genome sequenced, and their doctor could have that information when that was impossible just 10 years ago to even think about. So we've, you know, it's really made a big impact on the medical community. Okay, so I think I'll go back here. The last thing I want to mention is we do have a new program called TREND, and it's called Therapeutics. We love acronyms, TRND, Therapeutics for Rare and Neglected Diseases. And that is a new program, just what it says. We're looking to find drugs for rare and neglected diseases. Right now there are 5 pilot programs, 4 neglected and 4 rare and 1 neglected, and they're taking new projects on, 3 or 4 a year. And so that's a new thing that we're doing. So right now the pilot projects include something called diseases Niemann-Pick C, which is a rare disease, a rare leukemia, sickle cell anemia, and the last one is something called hereditary inclusion body myopathy, HIBM, another rare disease. And then the last project is on a parasitic disease. So again, we're getting into that. There's no reason why PXE researchers couldn't apply for this program to try to get funding to work on a drug treatment for PXE. But you have to know a lot about the disease. So again, right now we don't know what the, probably enough about this transporter protein, what it transports that's going wrong in PXE to do this. But in the future, this is something that the PXE community could be involved in. And I think that's all. I think what I have at the very end, this is the reporter tool I talked about, where you can go online and kind of find out money numbers. You can search for a particular scientist's name, see what kind of funding they have. You can search for a disease and see how much funding, that sort of thing. And then I'll just, well, I guess before I summarize, I'll stop again and see if there are additional questions.
Yes, I wondered, I know you're not directly involved with rare disease discoveries, but are there any successes you can point to of finding a treatment or a cure for a rare disease or highlight for us?
Sure. Well, William Gall, who's our clinical director here at the Genome Institute, he was instrumental in coming up with an eye drop to treat a disease called cystinosis, which is, causes blindness. And so he developed a drug. Essentially, what he first did was he was the first person to identify what was going wrong in patients that had this disease. So he identified, the enzyme that wasn't working properly because there was a mutation in the gene, and he was able to, understanding that pathway and what the enzyme did by doing basic research, he was able then to find a very simple drug, not a something that's already out there and could be used in an eye drop form to dissolve the crystals that were in these patients' eyes so that they didn't go blind. And so that was a success, and it was directly tied to doing basic research on the biological underpinnings of that disease to see how the disease, what went wrong. So that's an example.
Thank you very much. And also, can you talk about any recent breakthroughs in research in genomics and kind of explain what genomics is?
Gosh, that's hard. I'd say probably the biggest breakthrough in genomics is just literally the decreased cost of sequencing. So in other words, if you want to find out mutations in a gene, you have to be able to sequence that gene and sequence sometimes the entire genome. Many diseases are due not just to a single defect in a single gene. They're complex. There's many genes interacting. There's environmental factors. There's lots of things. So if you can sequence someone's genome very economically, that's an easy first step. It used to be you couldn't do that. You couldn't. It was too expensive. It was too difficult. So you were basically, guessing, hoping you could figure out what was wrong. But now you can actually just go ahead and sequence an entire person's genome for a very reasonable cost.
And that came out of the Human Genome Project?
That came directly out of the Human Genome, because we just didn't fund sequencing the genome. What we funded was technological development, the equipment, the sequencing instruments to make them, faster and better and cheaper to do.
And then, thank you very much. And another question is, we mentioned at the beginning that Sharon and Pat had come to NIH. Can you talk a little bit about how they're involved in the advisory boards and things like that?
Okay, I don't know as much about their current activities, but essentially what NIH tries to do is when we have advisory boards, we don't want to just have scientists. That's only a narrow view. So we try to have at least one or two what we call lay people or patient advocates or people that have an involvement in the biomedical community but maybe aren't researchers. And so we always try to have some of those representatives, or we have people that just come from other fields. And so that's how they first got involved. Is Sharon and Pat were asked, because of their involvement with PXE and starting a foundation from scratch, they were asked to be kind of the patient advocate representative on a couple of these advisory committees to start with. But of course, they're now very, very knowledgeable about the science as well. But that was their initial role. We just wanted to have a diversity of points of view on these committees and not just populate them only with scientists. We wanted ethical experts. We wanted people that were, in the clinics, nurses, people that were former patients, just the general public, just to have a diversity of points of view. So that's how they first got involved. But then they developed so much expertise that they've now since, been asked to do a wide range of things just because they have, great expertise.
And I think this will be the last question. Reach out. Programs designed to reach out to advocacy groups like PXE International. Can you talk a little bit about what NIH does? I know I've experienced a couple of their kind of outreaches to groups, small groups, and small disease groups.
Right. Well, we do have an Office of Rare Diseases Research, and so they do a lot of educational programs as well as giving out funding, where they basically, as you say, try to help rare disease advocacy groups, kind of think through what they need to get to where they want to go, which is usually, a treatment or a cure. And so it's often, running seminars to tell them, well, what are the pros and cons of running your own biobank? Do you want to just have an educational mission, or do you also want to fund research? And if you're going to fund research, how are you going to, leverage, you can't just do bake sales and have a few $1,000s. How are you going to get access to, NIH grants? How are you going to get researchers interested in even studying your particular rare disease? They give advice on how to create, research network, how to create a biobank, how to do, the things you need to do to move things forward. So we have a lot of those resources where we try to go out into the community and teach them about what we've learned. And PXE is often used as an example of like how to do it correctly or how to do it well.
Thank you. I've been to a couple of those outreach meetings, and the NIH really wants the public involved. Is the way they present it, and they really want to hear from you, whether you're a person who has something really rare that's undiagnosed or a group of representing a couple thousand people. They want to help you, and they want to help you know how to access them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, there are no more questions, and I personally have learned a lot about the NIH from you, Claire. Thank you very much. And did you have a closing slide about our upcoming webinars?
I do. Thank you for the reminder. There it is.
Thank you. We do have some webinars that don't have dates yet, but we're going to be scheduling them in the fall. One with Mike Dean, who's going to tell us, he's one of the researchers from NIH who developed some animal models for us, and another from Olivier Vanacker about PXE in children. He's a researcher overseas in Belgium, but works very heavily in PXE. And then a new session on how to access low vision services with our low vision presenter at our conferences, Wendy Mons. And all of the webinars, including this one, are available on our website for viewing. This one will take a few days to get up there, and you can just go to our website and look for webinars or go to that link there. If you have any questions on anything, please email us info@pxe.org or call the office at the 202-362-9599 and leave a message. We'll get back to you. And Claire, again, thank you very much for your time and for explaining the NIH to us, a huge institution in this short hour, but you've given us a good understanding of it.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, the webinar has concluded. Thank you, everyone.